up and bringing it and really scaring us with the information control versus democracy whole angle.
Right.
So, and I want to, if anybody has run out of cards and still has more questions or things, I'm happy to hand out more. But as soon as Rajesh is done, we'll open it up to question and discussion. And after that, there'll be dinner, and the smell is coming lovely from the kitchen area, and then there'll be the cultural program. So this is the last formal piece of this afternoon. And thank you all. And all yours.
Thank you, Sarah. And I will never forgive Pratyush for taking my time. But I'm going to try to do three very different things. The first I'm going to say is try to bring together some of the issues that people have already talked about today. But the main thing I want to talk about there is perhaps a little bit of thinking a little bit about the impact on wealth as opposed to income, right? Because so to give you an example, in this country, we know that the average wealth of a white family is 30 times that of the average wealth of a black family, right? That's not true of income. I mean, there is income disparity, and there's income disparity both by race and by gender and other factors, but that's maybe 30%, 40%, 50%. But wealth is much, much more unequal. And when you think about it, the impact, so what does wealth do to you? So wealth could take the form of property, could take the form of savings, could take the form of holdings like gold and other valuables. And so in that sense, wealth is a stock, right? While cash or income is flow. So you get income every day, every week, every month, depending on what kind of income you have. But the impact of something like demonetization on wealth needs to be understood very carefully. It was already mentioned today, I think Ajinkya mentioned his two different people, both his maid who had an issue with drawing money, her savings were no longer valid currency, and then the person who worked for him on the farm who had to borrow money to cremate his mother, right? So it's wealth that you use in those circumstances, right? So in India, the single biggest source of migration away from villages, so actually that's not true. The single biggest source of migration by the official statistics in India is women marrying into families who live outside that district. But if you set that aside, the second largest source of migration in India is health distress, right? So you get into debt because your family had a health emergency, and then you have to migrate somewhere else to pay for that. So that's the single, right? And so you can imagine that if you are a poor family whose wealth has been reduced to zero as a result of demonetization, and you fall sick, then you're going to have to take very extreme measures to address that. And so I heard about this actually pretty directly. One of my friends who's a faculty member, he runs a project called Project Prakash. So what project, it's a very well-known MIT faculty person, Pawan Sinha. So Project Prakash finds children, especially in UP. In fact, in many of the areas that were shown in Neela's presentation earlier, what Project Prakash does is that it finds children who have congenital corneal defects. So they were born blind by layperson standards, and it's a relatively easy operation, and so it, for free, fixes their cornea and then studies the brain functions that are potentially brought back as a result, right? So just because you have a functioning cornea doesn't mean that you will see if you've never seen before, but what they study is what are the kinds of things that happen. So what Pawan Sinha suddenly noticed is that after demonetization, there was a huge drop in the number of children who were coming for these operations. And you would wonder why, because the operation is free, the Project Prakash pays for their travel back and forth, and it gives them some compensation to ease their introduction into society, right? But despite all of these things, there was a drop. It turns out that these families are so poor on average that they don't have enough money, alternate money, to pay for the train ticket to come to Lucknow in the first place, right? So if I don't have the 200 or 300 rupees that I need to get to Lucknow, you can't do that, right? So this is a wealth impact rather than an income or a cash impact. So one thing, therefore, I want you to take sort of a close look at is where exactly is demonetization impacting people who are lower down in the caste or gender or other hierarchies, right? That the disproportionate impact will be on wealth and not just on income. So that's one thing to point to. Now, the second thing I want to talk about, very different from the first, is really what is, Arif started by introducing that there's a new world being born, except that we don't know what it is. We know that the old world is not working. And so what does something like demonetization tell us about this new world that is being born? And one thing I want you to, how many people here are not Indian citizens ever in their lives?
Sorry?
Who are never Indian citizens, right? So if you are an Indian resident or if you're an Indian citizen, you now have the option of getting something called an Aadhaar card, right? So the Aadhaar card is like a social security number in this country. While demonetization has been given an enormous amount of media coverage, you may or may not know that at the same time, in parallel, the use of Aadhaar is becoming more and more mandatory for things that you would have never expected it to be mandatory. For example, in the public distribution system, right, or ration card as we normally call it. You will not be able to avail the public distribution system if you don't have an Aadhaar card. The midday meal scheme. So imagine you are a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old child for whom the midday meal scheme is often the only nutritious meal you're going to get that day. You cannot avail the midday meal scheme if you don't have an Aadhaar card, right? So Aadhaar, which is a different form of information tracking by the state, different from cash and different from digital currencies, but nevertheless is the use of data to both monitor what's going on and offer entitlements and other public goods is also happening at the same time. So what I'm trying to say is that demonetization is not a one-off development. It is part of a series of developments that are all tied to how information is being gathered by the state and is going to be used. Now you may think that this is something new, but actually, when you think about it, the state has always been in the business of information, right? In fact, I might call a state as essentially a computer with guns, right? Because when you think about it, what does the state, what are the basic functions of the state? Bureaucracy, it's all done through, paper. Until now, maybe now it'll be all digital, okay? So bureaucracy, the law, education, the court system, and cash, and finance and money, these are the basic functions of the state outside of the military, right? So if you set aside the police and the military, all the other things that the state does is somehow has always been tied to information, but there have been very disparate kinds of information. Right? So the cash system is different from the court system, which is different from the pattas and the land records and all of these things, right? So what you have is 500 different kinds of information. Suddenly, I think the state across the world, in this country actually perhaps before anywhere else, realized that you can use computing as a common information language for all of these different forms of state activity. And invariably, that will lead to centralization of power, right? Because there's a huge information asymmetry between the person who has one store of information versus a person who has only one bit of information. So for example, if I know what are the patterns of cash flow all across India, and you only know what your business does, I have a lot more information than you do. But now if I know not only what all the patterns of cash flow are, but I also know all